Yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. My name is Emma Summers, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at Vector. Just to give a little bit of a background on Vector, if this is your first time joining one of our webinar series, we are a premier fund admin focused on closed-ended alternative investment vehicles. So we do all the back office support for funds, SPVs, and the entities surrounding those. I can't believe that we're here on the last session of this Essential Fund Launch webinar series. Thank you everyone so much if you're joining us from another session, or as well if this is the first session that you're joining. But I'm super excited. We have a really great topic to cover today, and that is the dreaded audit. So I'm really excited to have Dana Silveria here with me. He's from Frank Rimerman, and we're going to be going through some really great questions that we get kind of on a regular basis from people in the industry. Just to give some context of the timing and everything, we'll be spending about 45 minutes chatting through some questions that we've put together. And then we'll take about 15 minutes at the end to go through any questions that you have in the audience. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a little questions chat box. You can go ahead and put in any questions that you have there. Feel free to go and put them in as we kind of talk through this. If something comes up that's relevant to kind of what we're talking about, I'll address them then. And if it's a little bit outside, we'll touch on it at the very end. We definitely want this to be an interactive session. So please ask your questions as we go through this. But I guess, Dana, to start off, would love if you could give yourself a little bit of an introduction and tell us a little bit about Frank Rimerman, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and we really appreciate you allowing us to join. I'm Dana Silveria. I'm a partner at Frank Rimerman here. I've been with the firm for about 15 years. The firm itself has been around for 70 plus years and is firmly rooted here in Silicon Valley, which just brings with it the entrepreneurial and venture large primary focus there in venture capital itself. And over the course of my career, I've touched a little bit of everything in the private company sector with the various audits that we offer. But the last 5 or 6 years have really focused my practice on venture capital funds. So happy to share some insights here and hopefully make one of our big goals is to make the dreaded audits a little less dreadful. So hopefully we can share some thoughts and insights that help make the entire process a little bit more efficient.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And I'm definitely excited to dig into some of those, some of that 15 years of experience. So I'm really happy to have you here with us. As always, I'll start off with a really broad question. What exactly is a venture capital audit, and why is it important for firms?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So, at its very core, excuse me, a venture capital audit is a third-party independent audit firm coming in and quote unquote auditing the numbers. It's really kicking the tires on all activity, specifically the higher risk areas, which we can talk about. But the main goal is to give your investors and any regulatory bodies that extra seal of approval on the reporting that you're putting out. Why is it important? I think, I kind of touched on it there. 2 driving factors typically behind an audit are some sort of a regulatory requirement or a requirement with your investors that you've written into your LPA. Ultimately, the importance is just the amount of assurance that they get looking at the numbers, knowing that a third-party accounting firm has come in and given an opinion on those statements.
Mm-hmm. No, that's helpful. I think, we work with a lot of funds that need audits, that don't need audits as well. And so obviously having a firm like Frank Rimerman working on the audit has made our lives a little bit easier, which has been great.
Yeah, and just to interject one more thing, I think investor confidence is a big one that I should throw in there as well. And not only your current investors, but prospective future investors as well. A lot of times beyond the LPA requirement you might have or a regulatory requirement, it's often forward-looking as well when you have an emerging manager that's looking to do an audit, because there is that extra level of confidence that investors put into financials when they have that third-party opinion.
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot too on our side is, we're talking to an emerging manager that's kind of in between potentially needing an audit, maybe going the route of not doing an audit to save on the cost side. And one of the things that we always say is, if you're planning on raising fund two and you think that you are leaning towards having an audit, it's very much going to look more institutional grade. It's going to look better when you go to fundraise for fund two. So definitely the investor confidence side is obviously very important as well. So what are some of the key components of audit planning?
Audit planning, I would say the two key components are really the timeline that is put in place and then the division of responsibility. When you look at the timeline, I think having a timeline and staying on timeline is the biggest component of making sure that your audit goes as planned. Typically, what we suggest is starting from the end and working backwards. Generally identifying what your target delivery date is for your audit and your financial statements, and then kind of stepping back through the various pieces of the audit and the deliverables from each party is really kind of the way to set yourself up for the best chance of success. There's several deliverables along the way coming from various different groups. And so knowing what those are and putting realistic timelines in place to achieve is really paramount. When we talk about identifying responsibilities amongst the parties, the three big parties I typically identify are one, of course, the auditor, two, the general partner group or individual, and three, the fund administrator. And obviously the auditor has their role in the audit, but the GP themselves is responsible for the oversight of the fund ultimately and the ownership of the entire process. And so the level of involvement that the GP is willing to have, and especially with respect to the portfolio itself and the valuation marks, is key. And then, of course, the fund admin is a crucial part because they're typically the one quarterbacking the interaction between the service providers and the other service providers and the GP. And so making sure that reporting packages are ready and the supporting items that are needed for the audit are clear and available, ultimately help the audit go as smooth as possible.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that we do as well when we engage our clients and then work with their audit firms is that timeline component is so important, especially on the fund admin side. And so as a fund manager, you're really responsible to ensure that the timeline is moving forward and moving, in the right direction and everything's kind of hitting those marks. So making sure that you can check in with both your fund admin and auditor on a regular basis. We always try to do that as best practice. But that timeline piece is really, really important.
Yeah. And I would also say that I think when we talk about audit planning from the very beginning, the first thing a GP can do to set themselves up for success is create a service group around themselves to basically allow for communication and success. And so identifying the fund admin that you feel will be the best fit for you, and then allowing them to be a party in choosing the auditors and the tax folks ultimately just gives you a group that's cohesive in supporting the fund itself and its compliance and administrative functions.
Yeah, makes it easier when we've worked with someone before and have that process in place. Definitely.
Yeah.
So how do you as the auditor identify and assess the specific risks associated with VC investments during the audit process?
Investment. So the risk assessment process of the audit is a large piece of the audit planning on the front end for us internally. Investments, as you just noted, is obviously one of the key areas, one of the few key areas we really focus in on. The specific risks around investments, generally we group into two primary areas, and those are existence and valuation. And that's kind of digging into the accounting literature and the audit guidance. Those are the two kind of risk areas that you would see there. Existence, we assess and test existence as a specific risk through the most general thing we do is third-party audit confirmations. And you'll find that pretty prevalently among all audit firms. That's kind of the gold standard of existence testing. And what that is just directly investing your investment, what you're saying you own, with the company or with the fund of fund or whatever you're invested into. The additional procedure that can be done, or the alternative procedure we can do if we're not able to obtain that third-party confirmation, is to actually look at investment documentation. So executed purchase docs, executed subscription docs, anything of that nature is kind of the other way that we look at existence. On the valuation side, that's obviously a much larger and subjective topic, and I think we'll probably get into it a little more in depth later, but the valuation, the way we assess valuation and the risk around valuation is very circumstantial to each investment and the stage of the investment, and quite often in this venture capital world, the age of the investment. So that one is very much facts and circumstances based, and we spend a lot of time making sure that, to the degree we can, the valuations that the GPs are putting on their investments are reasonable given what's available.
Yeah, and actually a question to spin off of that that we get a lot is, how do you know when you need to bring in a third-party valuation provider when it comes to ensuring that that's adhering to, the audit and what's needed with the fund?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think it's a facts and circumstances decision, and I think they vary. Generally speaking, where we find a lot of value in a third-party valuation is when the company is a bit later stage and there's more there to really do a more standard valuation model of sorts, a more, one of the more legacy valuation approaches. The difficult thing with venture valuation often is that there's just not a lot to go on, right? The companies are very early stage. The operations are very preliminary. It's often, at a place where there's not a lot of operational data to go off of to do evaluation. And so in those instances, having a third party come in and tell you that the last round is what it's valued at, it can be helpful, but it's a cost benefit assessment of what you want to do. So generally speaking, as your portfolio starts to age, as you start to get more mature companies that can bear a more generic valuation approach, it can be beneficial to bring in a company or a third-party valuation provider to put something together for you.
Yeah, and what do I always hear? It's always doing valuations for a VC is an art, not a science.
Which makes it very difficult to audit. And I think that's what most auditors would tell you, is that there's just, as accountants, we love to find the rules and point to the rules. And the hard part with early stage venture-backed companies is the valuations. There's just, even the accounting guidance to some degree leaves a lot of discretion in how to value those companies, because there's not the hard evidence often to point to that we like to try to find.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess that's a challenge in itself, but speaking of challenges, so what challenges and considerations typically arise when, I guess, valuing VC investments? You kind of already addressed this here, but how does the auditor typically address these challenges?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And, oftentimes when the companies don't have something quantitative to point to drive kind of a traditional valuation technique, it often becomes a discussion more so on the qualitative and quantitative aspects of each company. Really, the approach we take is to spend the time with the GP to understand each of the companies, each of the investments, understand the basis of how they're deriving the valuation, what they think about the company's progress. It's really just getting and documenting and understanding around company status and the general economic and fundraising environment. So it does get a little bit more abstract, but at the end of the day, it's just making sure that whatever valuation the GP has landed on is reasonable given all the data that's available at a given point in time.
And I guess coming from a fund admin perspective, that's one of the things on the audit. So the fund admin is managing majority of the audit, but the one major piece is the valuation aspect, because it's so discretionary and it's so particular depending on the investment and the fund manager. That's something from the fund admin side that we don't typically get involved in, whereas we do majority of the rest of the audit process.
Yeah.
So
the reality is the GPs, the investors are the closest to these companies. And so
Right.
I think, a fund admin is usually really great at proctoring the discussions and keeping the information flow. But at the end of the day, the GP does have to be very involved in sharing the insights that we need to get comfortable with the valuation marks.
Yeah. How do fund managers establish and maintain effective internal controls? And how are these typically assessed when it comes to the audit?
So my initial thought here will sound very self-serving to this webinar, but I think working with a good fund administrator is probably the best thing you can do to establish internal controls. I think the first line of defense is a GP putting a fund admin in that has documented controls and processes around all the activities, but most specifically the financial activities, making sure that cash flows and whatnot have proper processes. The second piece of that is that there are internal controls that need to be put in place at the general partner level. So, beyond what the fund administrator can do, but a good fund administrator will also give recommendations and advice on what controls are needed at the GP level to make sure that the controls are satisfactory.
Yeah.
And then we basically come in and gain an understanding of those controls during the audit and make recommendations to the extent we can or need to around areas you can improve, areas where controls can be expanded to make sure that you are doing everything you can.
Yeah. So can you explain the reporting standards that VCs need to adhere to, and how are these integrated into the audit process?
Yeah, absolutely. So US GAAP is the overarching reporting standards that the majority of our clients fall into. There are others. We have a handful that are on IFRS and some other reporting accounting standards, but US GAAP is by far the most prevalent, as you would expect. Within US GAAP, ASC topic 946 is the specific guidance that really guides the reporting that investment funds do, both from an accounting treatments and just financial statement preparation and disclosures. So as you work with your fund admin and as you work with your auditor, generally you'll hear references to both GAAP and 946 as kind of the guiding standards on what your reporting should and will have in it.
Yeah. And most fund admins will, be in the know and understand the reporting requirements. Actually, all of them should be understand the reporting requirements when it comes to the audit side of things too.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing to add is that reporting standards. I guess the other piece of the puzzle is whether you're a registered investment advisor or an exempt reporting advisor, and ultimately that guides what oversight body your audit and your filings fall under, whether it be the SEC or the AICPA. So that's the other part of the guidance and reporting standards, but really underneath that, it's GAAP and 946 that drive.
Got it. So this is a good question, because this is definitely a tricky thing to manage when it comes to the fund admin side and the audit. But what documentation and records should firms maintain to facilitate the audit process, and how do you ensure accuracy?
So the two pieces there. So the documents and records that we typically focus on, and what I would recommend be the focus area for the audit process itself. So first is just the quarterly and annual financial reporting are the two big pieces to make sure that you're doing on those cadences, because that's ultimately what will guide both your interim audit procedures and your year-end audit procedures. The supporting documentation that leads into those quarterly and annual financial statements, two big areas to highlight there. One is the transaction docs, the support docs. So every time the fund enters into a investment transaction of any kind, you want to place a focus on getting executed docs for that transaction. And I say executed very purposefully, because what we often find during the audit process is GPs are really good at retaining the signature copies that they received to put their signatures on and send back. But there's the follow through on the back end to make sure that you're ultimately getting the duly executed, fully signed copies of the agreements. The importance there on the audit side is to make sure that we're using the ultimate numbers that came out in those final docs. It's not common, but there's always the chance that share numbers change or there's some slight modification between the execution copies that are received and the final copies. So as transactions occur during the course of the year, making sure that you have those fully executed docs come back on the back end of the investment and get retained for audit process is really key.
I was just going to ask a follow-up to that. How do you navigate that if you don't have fully executed docs? Because I feel like that's a very common challenge, especially on the fund admin side. We're managing this process, but we don't have fully executed docs half the time. How do you, as an audit firm, manage that?
The only other option we often have is to do an audit confirmation. So if for some reason the GP isn't able to get a fully executed copy of whatever transaction document it is, whether it's a stock purchase agreement or a safe or a convertible note, the option there that we can try to go down is sending a confirmation to the company itself to confirm ownership. But I think what we typically find is that putting the process in place where you're making the investments and ultimately, you track down the final executed copy within a period of time is the best path for success you can put in place. But you can always go the confirmation route if for some reason you aren't able to track down the company signed copy.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah. And then the other piece is just from a documentation and record standpoint is valuation support. That's one that is a little harder. When you're participating in a transaction and purchasing or selling or doing whatever you are involved, getting the documents is a bit easier ask. Oftentimes the harder ask is when you're marking your investment to a subsequent round, or there's a transaction that occurred where you're marking to whatever value was paid in that transaction. And so getting the documentation for those types of activities is just as important because we need them on our files to support the valuation positions you're taking. So as those types of things are occurring, as investor updates are being sent, as board decks are being provided to investors, as subsequent rounds are closing, to the extent the GPs can track down and retain, share with the fund admins, those supporting docs, that's always helpful on the back end as well.
Yeah. What do you do if a fund doesn't have, for example, like information rights, or they don't have access to like subsequent round information, but they needed it?
Yeah, we can. There's generally a few avenues we go. Again, we can try to do a confirmation of sorts where we just confirm the key pieces of the round details with the company. Oftentimes, companies aren't, where a fund is not participating and they don't have information rights. Companies won't want to share the entire stock purchase agreement, but we find they're often very willing to share kind of the key terms: purchase price, new lead, kind of the things that are important from an audit standpoint.
Yeah.
We also have several tools at our disposal of just more public data sets, PitchBook, things like that, where it's not, the data in there isn't bulletproof necessarily, but it's somewhere to look to see if we can corroborate the information that's being shared with us from the GP as kind of an independent way to look for another source. But ultimately speaking, typically the companies are willing to confirm the key details, at least for audit purposes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So moving on to something kind of interesting, and I have a couple questions here, but maybe I'll bring up the whole SEC thing that we were talking about earlier. So for everyone listening in, there obviously has been a lot of buzz around the new SEC rules coming out. And the question I have here is, are there any new audit challenges or trends emerging, and how can firms stay prepared?
New audit challenges or trends. I wouldn't say it's new necessarily, but valuations continue to be the most significant audit challenge we have, and not only to the extent that we've talked about, where venture capital investments are just difficult to value, and the valuation methodologies that have always been used are something that auditors need to try to get comfortable with. But the other piece of it is just the accounting guidance continues to put out more and more details that we as auditors need to collect around valuation marks and around valuation approaches. So I would just say the more involved the GPs can be and the more active they can be in the process, especially around communication on valuations, is just really the best way to stay prepared, because that's really the most subjective area, and that's where we need the most support in getting us the information. With respect to the SEC, I think, I don't know if you wanted to dive more specifically into something there, but I'm happy to talk about how, as far as trends emerging and whatnot, I think the trend there is just the regulatory environment around making sure that the rules and regulations on registered investment funds is as tight and there's as much oversight as there can be. And I think as more money and more scrutiny gets put on these funds, we're just going to see more and more of this type of oversight steps in place.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess my next question has to do around the regulatory and compliance, but are there any regulatory compliance issues that fund managers should be particularly attentive to during audits? And if you want to touch on the difference between, RIA and versus ERA as well, when it comes to the compliance piece.
Yeah, no. So I think, the compliance aspect, the register RIA versus ERA, registered investment advisor versus exempt reporting advisor, really is just a different level of, you put yourself under a different level of oversight when you register to be an RIA, and you come under SEC purview. And so ultimately this new SEC rule pronouncement, the new rulings, I find the most impactful piece of them to be geared at the RIAs, with the new audit rule and the quarterly statement rule primarily. Obviously, those are going to have direct impacts to any private fund that's an RIA, because you'll need to ensure, most already do, but you'll need to ensure that you have both of those quarterly statement and audit functions in place.
Yeah.
On the exempt reporting side, you still oftentimes will have an audit requirement from your LPA, but it's not driven by the regulatory compliance with the SEC.
Right. Yeah. And I know you touched on that earlier, that it's a lot of the times driven off of, your LP requirements, depending on who you're raising from. So shifting gears a little bit, are there any technology and automation trends that might enhance the efficiency and accuracy of audit procedures?
It's another good question, and I think it's a broad question where we sit currently. I think there's a lot that is probably coming down the pipe with AI and the way that's going to be utilized. Document crawlers and things that will be able to pull information from agreements and do various functions. I think as it stands right now, the biggest technology efficiency we've seen is just the sharing tools at our disposal around documents. I haven't been at this as long as some, but I remember back when I started, a lot of paper, there was a lot of paper sharing and looking at documents, and everything now is very streamlined and very digital. And so, the document sharing that occurs between fund admins and GPs, and then fund admins and auditors, I think has made the entire process just way more efficient. And I think it allows for a greater degree of document, version control, and making sure that we're all looking at the same documents in real time, and there's not any discrepancies there. The other piece that I would say is continually getting better and better is the confirmation process I've talked about a few times. Again, thinking back, I remember when it was snail mail letter you would send and hope that you got it back. We do most of that now, and I think most firms have an electronic option, but we do most of that now through DocuSign. And so the whole process is a lot quicker. It's a lot easier for the responders, and it's just a bit more efficient all the way around. We also utilize confirmation.com for all the bank confirmations, which is generally a key audit step for most financial audits. And so that, again, has replaced the old snail mail process. But as we look forward, more just around automation and the ability to do things, to utilize AI and the various tools that are kind of gaining a lot of notoriety, I just think it's going to allow for quicker. A lot of these documents we look at are huge documents. I think it will allow for quicker data. You can pull data out of those documents a lot faster, and just let the audit teams, the people, focus on the key risk areas and really completing kind of the steps around that data as opposed to the time pulling it out of the documents.
Yeah. It's interesting how AI has come up in pretty much every single one of these webinars. I think there's so much that can be done, especially with a process that is looking through these massive, documents and pulling out data and things like that. So I know we were a little bit of ways away, but I'm sure this type of stuff will be coming in very quickly and very soon, where we'll be seeing it a lot more.
Yeah, and so we'll see how it all plays out. It'll be interesting to see. There's always the hurdle with what we do, the amount of assurance that we need to put on things to make sure that users can put the confidence in the numbers that are audited. It'll be interesting to see if there's any lag behind in the audit side of things with the use of AI, just given the amount of people power that's still involved to make sure that things are done to the standards that we all have to abide by.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we talked a little bit about challenges before, but and one of my questions here was sharing some real world examples, which I feel like you've already shared a lot of the challenges that come with auditing. But I guess last year we've been hearing a ton about delays in audits and like things that can hold up the audit and all of that. So can you talk a little bit about what might typically delay an audit and how to, best practice about getting around that?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So the first one I think we have touched on a few times, and I think that's just the executed documents. I think when we talk about audit delays, probably the number one thing to point to is just a back and forth on audit requests that, the list never seems to kind of dwindle down. And oftentimes the list is comprised mostly of executed documentation. Valuation questions, things like that, you can jump on the phone and typically talk through pretty quickly. But tracking down documents typically involves some other party that needs to get involved to provide those things. And so I would say, as far as challenges and delays, getting out in front of the document, obtaining the documents is absolutely key as you kind of move through the course of the year. The other thing that we haven't really touched on yet, which I think is very important to highlight, is just late valuation adjustments tend to cause significant delays in the audit. It's oftentimes that we'll be working through the audit. The GP will notice something in the portfolio and need to adjust a company, whether it be up or down. It seems an easy enough task, but when you look at the back end of that from an audit perspective, changing the numbers changes all sorts of things within our audit approach and our file. We base everything off of materiality and scoping and sample selection. And so when you change the value of the portfolio, you ultimately pull and push on the knobs that allowed for all that sampling and scoping and materiality threshold setting. So I would say the biggest thing you could do is just ensure that as you work through Q3 and as you work through Q4 and the fund admin's preparing your reporting packages and you're signing off, the GP's involvement in that stage of closing the books and signing off on the portfolio is key. Obviously, there's situations where you're going to find out about something later on, and it's just the nature of it. Things happen. But to the extent you can get out ahead of it and just be a part of the process early on is very helpful to making sure that the audit stays on time.
Yeah. And something too, kind of alongside of that, is we as a fund admin, we're obviously tracking all your valuations and all your investment transactions, but it's very much best practice to keep your own record of those. So whether you have like an Excel spreadsheet or Airtable or something that you're logging your own valuation changes and transactions is one really great, because then you can go back and reconcile against what your fund admin has. But then also just to make sure that, you know, everything's staying up to date, and then you can be proactive in terms of letting your fund admin know of any changes, especially if they're something that is pretty last minute. So one question that I was going to have as well, or that I had as well, was we get this a lot with, you know, tax and audit firms where a fund comes in and they are like, why don't we go with a big four? Why shouldn't we use a big four? So what is the difference between working with a firm like Frank Rimerman versus, you know, working with a big four, and kind of why would a firm choose you guys?
Yeah, it's generally just kind of target client size, I would say, is the biggest thing. You know, we typically look to work with funds that are in the 50 to 100 million range, I would say is our kind of target first time client. The big four tend to be a lot larger than that, and it's just because their teams are built in that way and their fee structures are built in that way, and so they have a target client as well. That's usually the big driver between the selection of a big four versus a more regional firm. Getting more kind of zoomed in on why choose a firm like us over some other regional firms, I would say it's generally an expertise in this area that should be the key factor that you look at. As we've talked through a lot in various capacities in this discussion, venture capital is a somewhat unique area. And so I think if you choose an audit firm that knows venture capital well, you're going to set yourself up for a more successful audit. We hear horror stories all the time of funds that went with a firm that doesn't do a lot of this work. And I'll throw the disclaimer, this isn't always the case, but where they don't do a lot of this work. And so the questions they're asking around venture valuations and the question they're asking around allocations and carry calcs and the various pieces of venture capital just aren't always sensical, because they just don't know the nuance of this industry. So I would say that's the biggest thing. And that does carry over to some degree to the big four, because they obviously are large enough. They have groups that focus in this, but they also have groups in regions that don't focus on this. And so as you survey potential service providers on the audit side, I would just say that's a key question to ask, is whether this is an area that they have a large degree of experience in, because that can make your overall audit go a lot more efficiently.
Yeah. And then especially too, we keep talking about valuations, like it's so particular and subject to, you know, discretion when it comes to VC investments. I can't imagine, like, if an audit firm didn't have this type of experience, like, well, how would they know what to look at? I feel like it's so specific and so particular, you know, depending on the fund. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just a reminder to everyone, so we're kind of running up on time with our questions. So just a reminder for people to throw in some questions in the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner. I have a few more that we can go through, but go ahead and throw your questions in, and we'll talk about those in a second. I guess just to wrap up this section, so do you have any final advice or key takeaways that you would offer to fund managers seeking to optimize their audit processes?
I do. The final advice I would make is just the first service provider you should put in place is your admin. After your attorneys, obviously, for formation purposes, I would say pick your fund admin first, because that's going to be the day-to-day relationship that really keeps your fund operations moving. So finding a good fit there is the best thing you can do. And Vector didn't pay me to say that. But I say that because I think that's a key first person to put in place, because then they should be involved in the selection of both your audit and tax firm. And I mentioned that earlier, but I think the amount of synergy you can create between your fund admin and the other service providers are just a greater degree of reliance that you can place on them to help run the entire process. So working with service providers that all know one another, are familiar with one another, and have processes in place, to share documents and traffic information, will just make the entire process on all your compliance related stuff a lot easier and more efficient. The other big final advice I would make is just be active and be involved. Put some degree of emphasis on the year-end reporting that you need to do. Both, the unaudited quarterlies that you put out at Q3 and Q4. Q1 and Q2 are important as well, but Q3 and Q4 are the big ones that hit our desk, and so we care most about those. The more involved the GPs are in those quarterlies and annual processes, the more efficient and the better the entire process goes. So I know, we circling back to the beginning with the dreaded audit, I know the audit is not anyone's favorite part of the year. But I think to the extent that it can get the attention and time from the GP upfront, it just makes the entire process more smooth for all parties involved.
Yeah.
And then, I think the last thing to just mention, and going back to the service providers, is making sure you pick service providers that are the right size and the right fit really for your fund. Obviously, you can pick, cost efficient providers. You can pick the big name providers. You can pick somewhere in between. But ultimately, funds at different commitment levels and funds at different stages of group maturity you have different needs and have different cost thresholds that they can bear. And so I think picking good providers that fit your fund is really key in making sure that you have a good service suite around you.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. Super helpful advice. So yeah, just a reminder, go ahead and throw your questions in. We have one that is, what about timing? So if I am going to do a 2023 audit, when should I engage with an auditor?
Now, in short. So every audit firm is different, so I can't speak for everybody, but I can tell you that over the last few years, we've seen demand come earlier and earlier for funds looking out to their first audit needs. And so there's oftentimes an onboarding process that needs to occur, and that typically mid to late summer is when our firm likes to do the onboarding efforts. But every year, it seems that funds and fund admins come earlier and earlier to try to get proposals and get discussions going for year-end audits. So if you still have a 2023 audit need, I would recommend reaching out as soon as possible to us or to whoever it may be. And I would say even if you have a 2024 first audit that you're going to be looking at, I would say reach out now to whatever service providers you're interested in and get that conversation started. There's no harm in getting a auditor in place for next year, just to make sure you get a spot on the timing you want with the firm you want.
Yeah. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, but one other thing to bring your attention to is, depending on when you had your first close of your fund, if we're talking about a first audit in 23, oftentimes what we see is the formation attorneys will work in some language into your LPA that will allow you to not have that first stub period audit and start with an audit in your first full calendar year. So
that was the next question. So why might you waive the first year audit? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's completely case by case. What I generally see, and this is just my observation, is 6 months is typically kind of the crossover where it's more, it's more clear. If you do your close within the second half of the year, it's very typical to have your first audit requirement pushed to the next calendar year. That's not at all a hard line. We've seen much longer periods. We've seen shorter periods have requirements. But if you're closing at some point in 23, and especially at some point in the second half of 23, I think it's definitely a conversation to have with your attorneys and potentially with your LPAs or your LPAC. Not only from the administrative burden, but also just to save yourself a year of audit fees, because the cost to do the stub period procedures is a lot less than the full audit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So audit is typically known as the year-end procedures, but are there any times that you would talk to your audit firm during the year and bring up any questions?
100%. I actually think that's crucial to having a successful audit. Our firm puts a huge reliance on interim testing to be
Mhm.
able to be efficient after the end of the year. And so I think it's a key to having a smooth audit just because
Mhm.
of the way I've come to do it. I think you should be in touch with your auditor throughout the year. Anytime there's a transaction that takes place that you just want guidance on, anytime questions arise, I find it to be more a full-time relationship as opposed to just come in at the end of the year, do the audit, and leave. The real momentum picks up during Q4. We typically will do a very large amount of work during Q4 on the Q3 numbers that I've mentioned a handful of times.
Mhm.
And so I think that you should absolutely be in touch with your auditors during late Q3 and then throughout Q4 at a very bare minimum. And then obviously through Q1 as you work through the actual audit itself.
Yeah. I think that goes for pretty much any service provider too that you work with. Like we've always said, the earlier the better. And audit always comes in kind of as the last one. But then if you find out and select who you want to work with early on, then you can utilize that relationship when it comes to, questions or making sure that you have guidance on certain transactions and stuff. So always really helpful.
Yeah, and I think obviously there's certain parts of your audit that can't get done until the end of the year, but the reality is there's a large amount of transactional activity that occurs throughout the year that there's absolutely no reason to wait until January to look at. So
Mhm.
we take that approach and we try to look at basically 3 quarters worth of transactional activity in Q4 to
Mhm.
just get that piece done and allow us to focus on Q4 activity and then the year end, the stuff that you can't look at until year end.
Mhm.
That becomes the focus of Q1 and then an efficient turnaround to get the audit issued.
Yeah. I guess you're going to be starting to get into that time pretty soon here.
We
Gearing
yeah
up.
we are approaching quickly. Yeah, so it definitely takes what seems to be a very busy Q1 and early Q2 and spreads it out a little bit more
Yeah.
to help make it. And candidly, it makes the admins' lives a bit easier too because then we're not asking for everything in January and February. We're asking for it over a more extended period, which I think for the feedback we get makes things a little bit more bearable for the admins as they go
Oh,
through
yeah. So much better. Yeah.
through the audit season.
Yeah. So, how difficult is it to switch auditors? And if you decide to switch, when should you do it?
um, it's it's not difficult. It's definitely an extra step, but it's something that we see happen all the time, whether it be for just fit reasons or difficulties or whatever the case may be. I generally recommend if you're going to look to switch to start the process right after your audit is complete or your current audit is complete. Um, the best experience we're able to give during a switch is when you're doing it over the summertime, because there is some additional onboarding work that has to happen to go back and review prior year audits and do some additional work. So I think as early as possible is probably the short answer there.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it's something that happens often, so it's not a difficult thing to do. But the more time you can give to the process for it to happen, and for you to facilitate the transition, just makes it a better process.
Yeah. And then a spin out question to that, because we talked a lot about investor confidence before. When you are switching auditors, how do you message that to LPs? Is there normally any issues with that? Given that, audit templates or kind of formatting can change between auditors.
Yeah, I don't know, as far as communication goes and difficulties from an investor facing standpoint. I think it would be pretty case by case. And I say that because I think the reason for changing auditors is often different.
Mhm.
I think there's some where it's an easy conversation, excuse me, because they're there's a reason, be it you're moving to a larger firm because your group is growing, or there's something geographic where you want to have, a firm that has capabilities in a certain area. There's a whole plethora of reasons. That's not something negative per se.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, oftentimes it's timing related issues that cause changes. And so, investors are probably happy to see a change at that point if you're trying to move to get more preferential audit timing. But I think it would probably be something that you should involve your investors in as early as you can, at least your LPAC, your advisory committee, on why the change and what you're considering, and just kind of transparency, I guess, is probably a way to say it. We find that the more transparent you are around those types of things, the better the conversations typically go. Yeah,
that definitely makes a lot of sense. Awesome. So if no one else has any more questions, we can wrap this up. But Dana, is there any last minute things you want to say or want to add in before we kind of wrap everything?
Yeah, no, just another thank you for including us in this, and hopefully there was something of value that I shared, and we're happy to be a touch point for anybody. So if any questions come up or issues arise, whether you're a client of ours or not, we're always happy to pick up the phone and be a resource. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Well, we really, really appreciate you doing this with us. We have so many mutual clients with you. We love working with you guys. So I know we have a great partnership. Our fund accounting team loves working with you guys. So really great that. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience, I will be sending a follow-up after this. It'll have the recording of this webinar, a way to contact Dana if you have any more questions. And a little bit more information too about Frank Rimerman. So if you do have any questions, definitely look out for that email. I'll give you a way to email him. And then this is the last session of part 1 of our Essential Fund Launch webinar series. So very much appreciate everyone who has joined us over the course of the past few months. We are actually doing a part 2. We've had a lot of requests for a part 2. So we're working on some really cool other types of service providers. So we're doing like compliance and stuff like that. So stay tuned for more information on that. That'll be coming out soon. But yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you again, Dana. It was so great speaking to you, and really appreciate your insights. I definitely learned a ton from this. So I always love getting to do these because I feel like I learned so much. So thank you so much. Appreciate you being here, and thank you, everyone.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right. We'll talk soon. Take care.